Welcome back to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. So this is a brand new season. And if you missed the trailer, this season, there are 7 of us running and hosting the podcast. And it's actually part of a graduate course taught at Stockton University called Education, Genocide, Liberation. The goal of the course and of this podcast this season is to look at education's many, often competing roles in the world. Sometimes education might be a force for liberation. Sometimes it might be genocidal. It can be colonial, it can be a practice of freedom, and it can be much, much else. And as our guest today, Dr. Dani Friedrich shows, it's often many of these things, sometimes all at once. They can coexist, they can work alongside each other, they can work against each other, and they can even be written atop the wreckage of education's past, which I'm paraphrasing Walter Benjamin here. So Dani is going to take us through many forms of education that took place during and the lead up to and after the Argentine dictatorship. And he's going to explore how that period of time functioned, how it was taught afterward, how it continues to be memorialized in Argentine schools and in other places that we might call sites of public pedagogy, and how educational memory works and shifts and competes over time and place. A quick note about the structure of this episode. Dani and I will chat for about 30 minutes, and then you'll hear a quick transition noise. And after that, folks from the class, all of whom will soon take over as hosts or co-hosts, will jump in with comments or questions in a more open conversation format with Dani. So, Dr. Dani Friedrich, professor of curriculum and teaching, a full professor of curriculum and teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University. And since he was a guest in season 1 of the podcast, I get to say a friend of the podcast. Welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Hi, Jordan. Thank you for having me. I'm doing okay. And thank you, all of you. It's really cool to have a class that's also a podcast with so many hosts, with different interests, different entry points. So I'm glad to talk to you all.
Dani, could you take us through your both own experiences as somebody who grew up in Argentina, but also as somebody who studied this in your early scholarship? Kind of maybe start with who are you in relation to this as a project?
Sure. I was born in Argentina in 1978. For those of you who don't know, that was in the middle of the last dictatorship. It's not the dictatorship, unfortunately, it's just the last one. There were many before. But the last dictatorship in Argentina took place between 1976 and 1983. And so I was born in the middle of it. So I don't have personal memories of it. Like, it's not like that was not part of my childhood necessarily. But the dictatorship left a huge imprint in Argentinian politics and society. It left us with 30,000 disappeared. It left us with a legacy of oppression and torture, but also a need for reckoning, to think about how we got to that place, right? And so when I was a student, I went to high school in the early 90s. Dictatorship was not at all discussed. I went to a pretty progressive German immersion school. And so we talked about the Holocaust, we talked about history and critical thinking and all those things. But usually Argentinian history went up to the 1950s, and that was it. And so I never studied dictatorship, but dictatorship was very much part of what we talked about with my friends. Some of the protests went for the mothers that were this group of women activists that were protesting for their children that had been disappeared. The mothers were very much part of the political scene still in the 90s. And the grandmothers too. The grandmothers were looking for the babies that the military had taken and given out to other families. So they were their grandchildren they were looking for. And so all of that was very much part of the media, of politics, but not in school. Then I became an elementary school teacher. Elementary school in Argentina goes up to 7th grade. So I was what here would be a middle school teacher, but I was an elementary school teacher. And what was fascinating to me is that by the time I became a teacher in the early 2000s, the dictatorship was front and center in the curriculum. suddenly we're talking about it all the time. It was in most textbooks, and education law, uh, reform law and curricular reform law had just passed. And the dictatorship was one of the two topics of curriculum that was actually mentioned as mandatory in the curriculum in that reform, which is interesting. Like there was talk about mathematics needs to be this and that, but not a particular content. But also we need to talk about dictatorship basically in every class, in every grade. So I became fascinated by the shift. What happened from the moment I was a student to just a few years later, where suddenly dictatorship was all around us. I was very happy that it was, but at the same time, I was wondering what allows for a content to come in and what does it do to the content of the discussions when it's everywhere, right? Where suddenly you had to teach a particular book because it was banned in the dictatorship. You had to go to a particular site because it was cited. So everything started tied to that. And so it was very interesting to me. And so I said to pay attention to that. And then I said also to go for grad school and to have an adventure in the US doing a master's program. So in 2005, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin for a master's program, thinking that I would last there for 2 years and then go back. But once I was there, I was invited to stay for a PhD, and my PhD was exactly about that, about how the dictatorship was being taught and talked about in contemporary Argentina, and what were the shifts that had been taking place in how that content was made part of the official curriculum, what happened there, and what are the limits of schooling to deal with those issues, and what other kinds of spaces can deal with those issues that maybe are not part of school. So my dissertation, which I finished in 2010, was exactly about that, our relationship with a traumatic recent past, how it positions teachers and students and policymakers in relation to trauma, and to something that for, say, the teachers and the policymakers is part of the lived history, but for students is part of history. And so what happens in that new moment?
Before we really dig into that element of the work, I'm wondering if you could take us back to the dictatorship and what did formalized education look like during that time? And also, of course, in the midst of a dictatorship, education is happening outside of this as well. So what did kind of formal and non-formal education look like within the dictatorship?
Yeah, the dictatorship was very much part of the Cold War scene. It was supported by the US. Many of the torturers and policymakers were trained in the US on intelligence gathering. And so much of the curricular reform that took place during the dictatorship was of this anti-left, anything that seems to sound progressive or that sounds like critical thinking, anything that goes against what they call the Western Christian values that founded the Argentinian Republic. And so within schools, that meant intervention both at the macro and the micro level. One of the maybe most interesting phenomena is that in Argentina, especially in the 70s and the early 70s, there was a huge impact of Piaget and of sort of different ways of understanding literacy in regards to students' lives. And so holistic reading practices and all that were very much part of the Argentinian milieu in elementary schools. When the dictatorship came in, that was completely banned. And one example of this is that they made a change in which in grade 1, kids were supposed to learn letters A through M, and in grade 2, letters N to Z, which means that teachers had to come up with texts that only used letters A through M in first grade, which is not really a natural way of talking or writing or anything. But it was a way, I mean, while it seems like a caricature, it was really a way of controlling the sort of the micro physics of teaching and learning. It's just one illustration. And so that curricular reform went into all the grades. There was a lot of effort put into training students into telling on their teachers if the students perceive there to be any leftism in their teachers or their classmates. The curriculum was encouraging them to go to authorities and denounce them so they could be disappeared. I mean, they didn't talk about disappearances in those terms, but that they could be uh, fixed. And also at the university level, there was a huge impact, right? I mean, most of disappeared were students. They were intellectuals. There were people that were perceived to be on the left or friends of the left. There was also a lot of disappeared that came out from unions and work organizations, but the university was deeply affected. Private schooling had fewer controls. And so in a way, private schools use this to grow their market base. Their market. And then, like you said, Jordan, there's also a lot of education happening outside since there was so much supervision and control in formal spaces. There were tons of different efforts by different people to get together and study together, get together, read and debate, and also organize. I think studying and organization went hand in hand. One other interesting vignette is that one way in which the academics escaped the controls of dictatorship was by embracing really, really esoteric, difficult language, especially through Lacan. Lacan, for those of you who don't know, was a French psychoanalytic theorist. It's extremely difficult to read, but Lacan was a Marxist. He was very much on the left, but he writes in a way that is really hard. And so it was an explosion of Lacanian studies in Argentina, the dictatorship, because it was a way for people to talk about exploitation, domination, all those things with a language that the dictatorship could not pierce. They thought it didn't make any sense, so they didn't really police that. So right now, Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, is the city with the most psychoanalysts per capita in the world. And part of it is the legacy of dictatorship in ways in which psychoanalytic theory was taken up as a way to escape the controls of dictatorship.
I think also I had thought of how the dictatorship was teaching outside of schools more through propaganda, but what you're taking up is kind of the opposite, how resistant forms of education emerged in kind of an underground space. So you had mentioned at the top that what interested you was this shift. But before we get to that shift, what did teaching about the dictatorship look like, if at all, if it was taught at all, in the wake of it? So in the mid 80s, what did teaching in Argentina, what did they talk about when teaching Argentine history?
What's important to understand about the dictatorship, and like I think most dictatorships, they are not possible without the support of large portions of the population. And that's the part of the population doesn't want to talk about. It's much easier to put the blame on three generals, on the military, but those things don't sustain themselves, right? And so when democracy was reinstated, or at least a particular kind of democracy was reinstated in the 80s, dictatorship did not enter the curriculum, in part because people were very skeptical or afraid of examining their own practices during that time. Again, what I call the conditions of possibility for the dictatorship. And that's what I was interested in later in my dissertation. And so on the one hand is that, on the other hand, people were still afraid. Once you have a dictatorship that controls every move, that disappears people, that controls media and all that, it's not like the day dictatorship falls, people know how to be democratic. People automatically go back to a natural state where everything is good. That's not the case, right? These things have effects. And so people were afraid and were afraid that the dictatorship would come back, or also didn't know how to exercise freedom in many ways. And so it took a long time for this to be out in the open. There was a moment that was significant that has been in two really good recent Argentinian movies, which was in 1985, when the trials against the dictators, it was the first time in Latin American history that the dictators were put on trial, the democratic period. And those trials were televised and were transmitted via radio to the whole country. And there were testimonies from people that had escaped the concentration camps, that had been tortured and let go for different reasons, right? And I think that was a moment in which the opposition could not deny what had happened anymore. They could not say this was fake news. I mean, we live in a very different media environment right now. By that time, there were 3 TV channels and they were all airing this. The radio was all about this. The newspapers were all about this. And so that was a huge like moment. But it's not like, again, this happens and suddenly everyone is teaching about it. Curricular reforms and thinking and teacher education, all of that takes years. And so the first time, in the late 90s was the first time where this actually entered the official curricula through the textbooks and in some policies, and not in the whole country. It started in the city of Buenos Aires, and then it started moving in different places. And only in the early 2000s did it become a national curricular guideline.
And what caused that shift? Beyond, you said broader shifts and curriculum is just moving behind, but what allowed that moment to be when education took on this different role?
There were several things. On the one hand, there's a generational shift, right? Once the teenagers and the very young people that had been living through dictatorship started growing into being teachers, but also being policymakers and having more of a role in the political arena, there was a demand for that, right? And they had a different perspective than the people that preceded them. There's also a matter of psychological effects of trauma and the way in which trauma cannot immediately be addressed. So you have to have a time to process, a time to get to know yourself again, right? Who are you now? There was also prioritizing movement in educational publishers, that really is just a diversity of textbooks that was not there before. And so when you have a huge marketplace of textbooks, some textbooks are going to try to cater to the more conservative section of the civilization, but there's also a market of progressive sectors. So you'll have people writing those textbooks, right? And then you have the parents demanding that their stories be told, the parents demanding that the schools help them tell their story to their kids. They didn't want to be alone in this. So I think there's no one causality explains why at that moment, but it was a series of things. I think also internationally, there was a shift in the discourse about genocide, about Holocaust, memory, that also provided with more tools to think about these things.
I know that's a huge shift that people talk about always in their context. When I was a teacher in the late 2000s, around 2010, all the teachers kept saying, we were in New York City, and they're like, oh my God, we're going to have to actually teach 9/11 versus just being something that you lived through. So what was that like for you as a teacher to teach this thing that your education was, of course, you were 5 years old, but, growing up with it?
I was a very young teacher and very naive and very in love with my own power, right? Like many teachers are. And so it was exhilarating in some ways, but it also led to a lot of mistakes or things that I would have done differently, of course, with a little more experience. But what was interesting for me was that it didn't feel like I was doing this on my own, like I was rebelling and therefore I was teaching leadership. No, like we were getting materials from the government, from NGOs, from publishers. It was all coming to us. There were opportunities for professional development. So there was a way, at least in the city of Buenos Aires where I was teaching. I cannot speak to this wave reaching all the corners of the country, right? But there was such an energy about embracing this and about seeing how it could be connected to literature and to art and to math and to social sciences, all those things. It was a hugely educational moment for me too. And I think the students could perceive it.
So that's interesting because you're talking about this as this blossoming, this moment of possibility, but a lot of your work actually talks about the limitations. So where do you see the limitations of education as a form of memory work that teaches about genocide and things like that?
Well, I mean, when I was 21 or 22, I was not seeing the limitations of education, right? And you were asking me about how I felt then. I think that I started being skeptical of some things even then in my later years teaching. Like I said, it was interesting, for example, when we were told we need to teach this or that novel because it had been banned to dictatorship. That we had to teach with this method because it was banned. And so I started to think of this as phenomena that go, so as two sides of the same coin, like different ways of thinking about authoritarianism as fascism, as dictatorship, but also what is the way in which authoritarian ways of thinking can permeate even the most progressive spaces, right? How politically at a time, it was a discourse that would start growing and they would explode a while later. I would us and them. And us were the real Argentines, the progressives, the one that fought, the ones that resisted. And they are the dictators, they are the fascists and all that. And part of the argument I make in my dissertation is that that is super easy. It's always easy to be on the side of the good guys, right? And that also means you can't take responsibility for how you were complicit in the emergence of dictatorship. It's not like three people deceived a country. The country went to sleep and suddenly the country awoke and kicked them out. And you're asking about the limits of education. I think the limits of education have to do in part with that, with how much is education willing to be used to look critically at itself, right? How much is education willing to ask kids, hey, go home and ask your parents what they were doing during dictatorship. Right? Don't ask your parents what was going on. Also, part of it is that education is so much grounded on a notion of progress, of evolution, of going from bad to good, from less to more, as if education was a linear thing. And that progressive here in terms of progress makes it very hard to think about history resonating and having echoes and not being progressive, being just a movement that we don't always know where it's going, but we can't assume it's always going forward. And sometimes I ask myself, like, what would be the left of school without that notion of progress? What would be there left of school without the notion of the more educated we get, better we get? That's the other part, right? Sort of the dictators were highly educated. Like many of these people that support these regimes, then and now, there and here, are highly educated. Some of them in institutions we work in, some of them in the Ivies and all that. So is the solution really more education? Is that it? Like we just need more education. We need more kids to go to school. We need better curricula. Like is education always the solution? And that's not even to say that education is the problem. I'm just saying education is neither. Education is just it's something else, or it depends on when and where, which context, right? But this, how did my friend Cynthia put it? She said, she called it like a pedagogical optimism. The dangers of pedagogical optimism, right? The faith in education, the blind faith in education as a solution to all our social problems. I think also that puts the responsibility on us. Like if problems are not solved, then it's all teachers' responsibility. It's all educators' responsibility, all curriculum makers' responsibility. And that's, for me, needs to be contested.
I think that fits perfectly with one of the pieces that you wrote about this topic, that not only are these things existing and competing with each other at all times, they're often happening in the same place. And that maybe is where we can move a bit outside of school. So can you, I don't want to frame it too much, but you wrote a piece along with a couple of co-authors, including our next guest, Dr. Kath Goulding, which talks about the idea of a curricular palimpsest.
That piece an interesting history that I was teaching a course here at Teachers College on memory, history, and curriculum, which was one of the first courses I taught and I keep teaching it every other year. And for their final papers, two of the students wrote independently, without talking to one another, about sites that at different times in history functioned as a concentration camp, a school, and a museum. I had written about a similar space in Argentina, the Navy School of Mechanical Engineering, it was started as a school. Then the dictatorship, it worked as a concentration camp while still being a school. So in the day it was a school, but in the basement they had cells, and some of the students were being trained on how to torture and interrogate people there. And then after the dictatorship, and after a while of being abandoned, it was turned into a museum. And so these two former students, Walter and Kath Golding, and I wrote this piece talking about what is it about these sites in Argentina, Haiti, and Vietnam. No, sorry, not Vietnam, Cambodia. Sorry, Haiti, Cambodia, and Argentina. What is it about these sites that allows them to be at the same time, at different times, same space, museums, concentration camps, and schools? And we talked about what is it about those three kinds of institutions that share commonalities. And the palimpsest is this idea that before modern technologies allowed people to print, they had this sort of palimpsest was a sort of canvas where people wrote on, but then in order to write something new, they would erase what had I written and they would write on top. But the issue was that there were always traces of what had been written before. So our argument in the piece is that part of what connects museums, concentration camps, and schools are the ways in which the traces of one are inscribed in the next, right? Not only architecturally, they share something, but also there's something about education and torture and display that draw us to those places as palimpsest, as history, curricular palimpsest.
I also think that connects back to what you were talking about earlier, that there's not just this education as a liberatory force. It kind of traps us back into the other roles that it has played, even as we do go to the museum and do education as memory work. We're forced to also reckon with how education has been this force to disappear people, specifically disappearing students and teachers. And it has been used as a force to teach the people enacting these things. I think it's been floating through the entire conversation we've had, but I have to ask about now. You're talking about, I think I want to be careful and say that let's not just assume all dictatorships are the same and everything is a dictatorship, and we can't always do a universalizing one-to-one comparison. But I encountered your work. We first met just after, I think, like 2013 or so, and I think your book came out in 2014, and you haven't really returned to this work. So what does it mean in this moment to talk about disappeared people, to talk about reckoning with a dictatorship with which many are complicit, and to ask things like, go home and talk to your parents about what they were doing during that time? What does it mean to think about this in educational terms in this moment?
I wouldn't say I never went back to it. I think I never went back to the Argentinian dictatorship. I think for those of us who study issues that's so traumatic and torture and all, it takes a toll. And so I felt like I needed to take a break. But the question behind it, right? Which is, one of the questions is, how do people get to normalize this, right? And this question of what were your parents doing, it's also a question that we need to be ready for our kids to ask us, right? What were you doing when all that happened? Right? What were you doing when the state, they took authoritarian action against universities, against the place you were working? What were you doing when there were masked people on the streets? disappear immigrants and take them to other countries? What were you doing? And I hope that my answer was not the answer that my dad gave me when I asked him that question on dictatorship, which was, well, I didn't know better. I thought it was normal. I thought that was the way the world was supposed to be. I know it's not the way the world is supposed to be. So, but it's very hard, because one thing that is deeply frustrating to me in the current moment is how people that have a lot of privilege and power in their jobs, say because they have tenure or they're full professors, or they would rather stay out of it. They rather like just let it pass under the radar, as if fascism was something that will just merely disappear. And this is where I think that I hope that people in this country and others listen to people from the global south that have lived through this, that know that the only way to go through it is to struggle. Like dictatorship did not end because they got bored of being dictators and they left, right? It ended because people fought, because there was protest all the time, because people made it impossible for them to continue governing. It took a while, everyone. I'm not like having a utopian vision here, but but these things happen through action. And that action is both in the classroom and outside in the classroom. But the current moment is extremely scary, because I think that many people in the US, because they have never experienced, in many ways, these authoritarian regimes, they maybe don't have all the tools. And also, it's something I was telling my students yesterday, and I think we may have talked about this over at some point. And feel free to edit this out or not. I don't care. But if you're, say, a student in a graduate program, and you say, well, I'm not going to speak out now because I'm really in a vulnerable position. I can't speak out now. And then you get a job and you're tenure track, you're untenured, and you say, well, I'm not going to speak out now because I am really in a vulnerable position. I could be denied tenure. And then you get tenure, say, well, I want to get promoted to full, right? I don't want to speak out now because I really need to protect myself. I'm still vulnerable. By the time you get to full, you don't know how to speak out anymore. Those muscles have atrophied. And I'm not saying this of all my colleagues. They're wonderful people out there doing really important work, right? There are fantastic people at Columbia and other places speaking out, really not only talking, but putting their bodies on the line, right? Unfortunately, I think the majority is the other case. And that is part of like why we need to look at these things and not generalize, not think of the case of Argentina can be generalized. No. But if there's one thing that can be generalized, is that struggle is part of the deal. Like you can't avoid that. And if you avoid that, if you're lucky enough that you get out of it, how can you be okay with yourself? How can you answer that question from your kids? What were you doing?
Yeah. I think that there's a flip side to that, where you do need to look at your position and recognize who might be vulnerable and who you do need to, where you need to put your body on the line because people standing next to you might not be able to in the same way.
100%. And I think those always relative. But what I'm saying is that if you're always waiting for you to be safe first, I don't know that you ever get that, because even if you're a full professor, you could say, well, but like I cannot put, say, my job on the line because my kids need me to eat. And so there's always something that is going to make you vulnerable. But that vulnerability is relative to the space. So as a student, yes, you're a student, but also you're a graduate program. You're not, I mean, you also have some privilege and power. And within being a student, if you're a white dude, you have different positions of power also to put your body in front of others, right? And so, of course, it's absolute to just student or non-student, but it's about the exercising of the critical muscle. Because it's always easy to talk about social justice and to talk about all these things when it's safe, when there's no risk. But if you can only do that when it's safe, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to the world around you that you're only willing to speak out when you're not speaking out, you're speaking to other people that agree with you and there's no risk.
I think just to bring us to a close here, I'm thinking of two things. I don't remember. I'm pretty sure you told me this, but I use it all the time in my class. But I may have started saying it and we started saying it together. Asking yourself always, what injustice can I not tolerate? Because of course we always live in an unjust world, but you have to be able to answer that question for yourself in how you live every day and how you study and struggle in every day.
We're all full of contradiction, and we need to figure out which of those contradictions we're living with, right? I mean, of course, I'm for fair labor practices, and I'm wearing clothes that are all made in China, probably in sweatshops, right? We have to be able to figure out what are those things we can live with and which ones we can't. Even when I'm talking about the thing we're talking about, speaking out and being like, I'm not speaking out all the time. I need to rest. I need to be with my family. I need to do things that bring me joy. Right? It's not sustainable to be all the time out there. But we have to also come to terms with the fact that in those moments that we're resting, I want to enjoy more crap is going on. And so we need to figure that out. But the solution to that question can be, well, since there's not much I can really do about those injustices, I'm just going to not do anything.
I was wondering, you discuss a lot of like the multiplicities of narratives within different spaces of memory for the military like regime and the crimes that they committed. And what impacts do you feel that has had on the people that those projects are accessible to? And are they accessible to like a large amount of the population, or are they like limited in scope to who can come and see them?
Are you talking about the memory spaces?
Yes. So you talked about ESMA, for example,
Yeah.
In the park.
Those spaces are physical spaces, right? And while they may have websites, there's something out, especially in ESMA. If the first time I went, I had to leave because of ghosts. There's no other way I can describe sort of the specters that were living there. I knew what had happened there. I was not ready. I had not prepared myself to be there. And so after half an hour, I felt in my body I had to leave. Then I got more ready and I went back. And I went back a couple of times to gather data for dissertation and all that. So that bodily experience is not available to anyone that can't make it there. It's not something that happens on a website, right? So in the website, you may see the space and you can read that story. But part of what makes these memorial spaces really rich and important is the space itself. But they are public, they are free. That's one way in which they're accessible. They're also accessible in terms of like physical accessibility, like ramps and everything that's needed for all the signs were on Braille. So it's very well thought out, but you have to be there. For the memory part, I mean, for me, that's the most wonderful space just because it has no narratives, right? It doesn't have any post narrative. You can make the narratives by yourself, by the art that you encounter and what you are thinking about in the moment. And again, that is an encounter between you and the art. And so I don't think that I can reproduce so easily for people that are not there. But since then, there have been a ton of like online public pedagogy projects that have tried to make different aspects of the work more accessible to people that are not physically there. I have to also say that Argentina right now also has a president that's very much friends with Trump and has done many of the same policies here. So all the funding for the sites have been taken out. They're all being buried in bureaucracy and complaints and anti-wokeness crap. And so we're seeing a lot of similarities there and here too.
Is like the lack of a cohesive narrative that in a way beneficial to these sites because they don't have like you kind of choose like you have this multiplicity that you pick up on as you're going through, but then like different kind of pieces.
I wish fascists were as nuanced as that, right? But they see memory and it's like, no, it's wrong. It's memory means like going back to a revisionist past and forgetting the glorious past of the nation. Anything that questions the glorious past of the nation is now deemed immoral.
For educators out there, definitely newer educators, What advice can you give a teacher who is trying their absolute best for their students to make the connection, the same connection that you make with these events, whether it's personal to their country or to their own background, but they're having a difficult time in helping them because of their own environments, because of their colleagues and their education systems?
That's a good question, Sarah. I think that teachers, and especially young teachers, have a tendency to see themselves as the lone warriors, right? Sole saviors of the classroom, the sole saviors of a rotten system. And I think that's unsustainable. It's completely unsustainable. You have to find your people. You have to find the communities to sustain you and that can help you build together. For many reasons, whatever you build by yourself is going to come down in a minute the moment you leave. So that's not sustainable for the kids. Also, it's going to burn you out. And so I think there's about, first of all, choosing your battles, but also they shouldn't be your battles. Even in the most restrictive environments, I can assure you that if you're teaching there, it's because someone hired you and you got to that place. And you have to find the people that can build that community with you, either inside or outside the school. If there's no one there, my advice is leave. I mean, to be honest, because it is not, I mean, and if you see yourself as the lone savior, you have to examine that, whether really you're the lone savior or you want to see yourself as the hero of your own story. I think that's a tendency that many teachers have, to see themselves as the hero of their own story. That's really important to question a little bit and to break apart.
Today's episode was produced by all of us in the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like, subscribe, follow us, rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram, where Another Ed is possible. Since we're starting a new season, we're also looking for guests, so if you know anyone, if you are someone who'd be interested in participating, don't hesitate to reach out to us on Instagram. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.